Before dawn, the back of a store looked less like a parking lot than a place the weather had decided to erase. The wind came around the loading bay in long, flat blows that shave heat off metal, off concrete, off anything foolish enough to hold still. Freezing rain tapped against the corrugated walls, then hardened there. Cartwheels locked in place under silver skins of ice. Pallets darkened, ropes stiffened, and the yellow security lights above the service road burned through a halo of sleet, turning every drifting sheet of rain into needles. It was the kind of cold that did not feel dramatic at first. It felt administrative. It closed fingers. It thickened zippers. It slowed thought. It moved through wet denim, through sleeping bags, through pride. In weather like that, people did not lose arguments with winter all at once. They lost them in smaller pieces. First the feeling in the hands, then the appetite to fix a problem, then the judgment to know when they were in danger, then the will to move. Behind a Walmart where customers never looked and most employees only passed through at speed, there was a narrow recess where two concrete walls met the steel side of a recycling dumpster enclosure. By day it was ugly in the plain, forgettable way backlot spaces are ugly. Damp cardboard, broken pallet slats, a smear of old salt, plastic wrap caught in a chain-link seam and rattled when the wind got hold of it. But under hard weather, ugliness sometimes concealed geometry. That corner sat out of the prevailing north wind. One wall held the day's warmth longer than open air. The dumpsters themselves, squared and heavy, blocked the worst of the cross gusts. Overhead, a lip of the roof and the angle of the enclosure cut some of the falling eyes before it could drive straight in. It was not a place anyone would choose for comfort. It was a place someone might choose if comfort was no longer one of the available categories. By the time the ice storm warning reached the night crew on their phones, he had already been studying that corner for 3 days. His name was Raymond Cole, though most people behind the store knew him only as the man with the cart and the gray watch cap. 52 years old, lean in the way long hardship makes a body lean, not from discipline, but from subtraction. His beard came in unevenly silver and brown. His jacket was a faded canvas work coat, with one cuff burned dark from some old welding spark. He moved without wasted motion, and there was still a trace in him of the kind of man who used to carry tools for a living, not because he talked that way. Raymond did not volunteer his history, because of the way he looked at broken things. He had once spent 15 years doing maintenance for apartment buildings and small commercial properties, not the glamorous kind of work. Roof leaks, furnace filters, frozen condensate drains, door closers that failed in January, duct tape used the right way and the wrong way, cheap thermostats, wet insulation, air leaks hidden in places tenants never thought to look. Before that he had worked sheet metal with an HVAC crew long enough to learn a rule that never stopped mattering. In cold weather, heat is not just something you produce. It is something the world steals. If you cannot make much of it, you had better get very good at slowing the theft. Then came an injury, then lost hours, then debt, then a truck that quit at the exact moment he needed it not to, then a winter where one bad month became a next. By the time he understood how far he had fallen, the shape of his life had changed. Storage unit gone, room rental gone, pride pared down into logistics. Where to wash, where to recharge a flashlight, which public bathroom had warm water, which churches served dinner without questions, which shelters were safer on paper than in reality. He had tried the city's shelter more than once. He had left each time more tired than when he entered. Lights all night, coughing, fights starting out of nothing, boots gone missing, sleep that never became rest. There are people for whom shelter is rescue. There are others for whom shelter is another negotiation with chaos. Raymond was in the second category, so he made his own calculations, the way he had always made them, quietly and with more attention than anyone expected from a man pushing his life in a shopping cart. When the forecast began to harden from cold rain into a real ice event, he listened the way tradesmen listen when weather threatens work, not to the adjectives, to the numbers. Temperatures falling from 28 to 14 by midnight. Wind gusts climbing above 30. 0.3 of an inch of accreting ice, then more. 2 nights below the point where damp clothing stops being uncomfortable and starts becoming a problem the body may not solve. A car in those conditions can kill you if you run it wrong. A tent can kill you by pretending to be enough. An ordinary sleeping bag on bare concrete can become a slow mistake. Raymond did not need anyone to explain this. He had spent 3 winters learning the hierarchy of cold the expensive way. Wind mattered, water mattered, but the ground was the first assassin. Concrete in winter was not just cold, it was greedily cold. It took warmth faster than air, faster than fabric, faster than tired people noticed. A person who thinks he is losing to the weather is sometimes losing to the slab beneath him. So he went looking for what poor people in danger have always looked for. Not comfort, not even safety in the full sense, but an angle, a hidden advantage, a way to trade knowledge for what money could no longer buy. At first, the man on security thought he was just doing what he always did in bad weather, circling the edges of the property, checking which alcoves were already occupied, counting who might run him off before midnight. There were 3 guards who rotated through the back lot on most nights. Alvarez, thick-necked and impatient, who had the habit of speaking to everyone as though they were about to do something stupid. Mason, younger, less certain in his authority, more likely to shrug than threaten. And Keene, older than the others, the kind of man who had spent enough years working nights to recognize when someone was not hunting trouble, only trying not to die. The first night, Raymond dragged 2 broken pallets toward the dumpster corner. Alvarez laughed. Not a big, theatrical laugh. Something meaner than that. Casual. "Are you making a condo back there?" he called through the drizzle. Raymond did not answer. He tipped the first pallet on edge, checked which slats were split, and broke off what he did not need. The second night he came back with flattened appliance boxes, a torn moving blanket, a roll of contractor bags, a short coil of nylon cord, and 2 full-face foam panels with one corner chewed up from forklift damage. Someone from receiving had thrown them into the dry cardboard dumpster because the shipment they protected had arrived ruined. Raymond asked no one for permission. He asked for nothing at all. He took only what had already been discarded. By then, Mason had started watching with a mild fascination reserved for people whose decisions make no sense until suddenly they do. "What is that cardboard?" he said. "Mostly air," Raymond told him. Mason frowned. "Looks like cardboard." Raymond slid the foam sheet against the wall and measured the gap with his hand. "That's why people get cold." It sounded like a joke until later, when it didn't. He did not build quickly. Fast work is for men with spare materials. Raymond built the way people build, when every piece has to justify itself. He cleared the corner first, scraping out soggy paper pulp, twisted wire, bottle caps, and old salt granules with a broken snow shovel missing half its edge. He chose the clean side of the enclosure, the one near dry recycling rather than food waste, because he understood that rot is its own weather. He laid down a sheet of thick plastic, then lifted the first pallet on top of 2 plastic milk crates, so the wood sat 4 inches off the slab. Over that he placed a second pallet crosswise, offset just enough to spread his weight and keep the slats from biting into his hips while he slept. On top of the pallets he laid flattened cardboard in alternating directions, the ridges running north-south on one sheet, east-west on the next. The corrugation created tiny air spaces. Tiny air spaces, multiplied enough times, become a strategy. Above the floor, he built inward before he built up. He knew better than to waste volume. People imagine survival shelters as miniature rooms. Raymond built a vessel closer to a capsule, just long enough for his body, just high enough to turn onto one elbow, just wide enough for one shoulder to roll. 6 feet 2 inches from foot to head, 34 inches at the shoulder, 28 inches at the low end. That smallness was not misery by accident. It was part of the math. The less air inside, the less air you have to stop from becoming the same temperature as the dark. The outer skin was patch plywood on one side and pallet slats on the other, skinned over with cardboard, plastic, more cardboard, then the torn moving blanket stretched tight and tied down under the base. Inside that, he set the foil face foam with the shiny side toward the living space, then taped the seams with scavenged aluminum tape in neat silver lines that made the whole thing look, from the right angle, like a strange low machine abandoned in the wrong decade. At the entrance, he did not leave a direct opening. He built a short dogleg crawl, a little angled throat the wind could not blow through cleanly. Cold air like straight lines. He denied it. He did not talk while he worked. He tested. He knelt inside for 10 minutes while the temperature sat at 30 degrees outside and the wind was only moderate. Then he crawled back out, adjusted a seam, lowered the entrance flap by 2 inches, and went back in. He held the back of his hand near the roof line. He checked for moving air on his cheek. He watched where his breath condensed. He returned the next afternoon with a strip of carpet padding someone had left by the compactor and added it under the shoulder area. Because pressure points pull heat faster than people think. He cut 2 vents the size of matchboxes high at the rear, shielded by little taped hoods, because he knew a shelter can suffocate a man more quietly than the wind can freeze him. Survival is never a single problem. It is competing failures, each waiting for a chance. The part that made the guards shake their heads came last. Against the inside wall nearest the store, Raymond mounted a narrow board he had cut from a broken shelving display. Under that board, cushioned between layers of carpet scrap and wrapped in a contractor bag with only the terminals exposed, he placed a small sealed battery from a discarded mobility scooter. It was old but not dead. During the day, he charged it in fragments where he could, sometimes at a church drop-in center, sometimes from an outdoor maintenance outlet behind a laundromat where no one minded if you were discreet, sometimes not enough at all. To the board he wired a low-voltage heated seat pad, stripped from a junk truck accessory he had found months earlier. Not a space heater, nothing loud or glowing, just a thin electric element designed to warm the place where a body actually loses the fight first. He was not trying to heat winter. He was trying to heat Raymond Cole. Inside the capsule, that distinction changed everything. To Alvarez, it looked ridiculous. A trash bunker, a cardboard coffin with wires. "You're going to cook yourself or freeze yourself," he said one night, pausing under the sleet with his flashlight aimed low. Maybe both. Raymond was sitting cross-legged inside the half-finished shell, fitting a piece of foam around the battery compartment. "Only if I do it, stupid," Alvarez snorted. "That thing won't hold heat." Raymond rested the foam in place and looked at the guard without annoyance, without pleading, almost without expression. It doesn't have to hold all of it. There are people who hear competence only when it arrives in a clean shirt. Coming from Raymond, behind a dumpster, with cardboard under his fingernails and his whole life stacked in a cart nearby, the sentence sounded to them like stubbornness. Nothing more. The world trains itself every day to miss intelligence when it comes in damaged packaging. Even Keene, who was less eager to mock, told him the storm would be too much. Not cruelly, just plainly. "This one's mean," he said. "You ought to go downtown. The warming center's open." Raymond nodded once, as if acknowledging the fact of the storm rather than the advice. "Maybe," he said, but he kept building. By the 4th evening, the shelter had taken on a shape that made people stop calling it a pile. Not because it looked pretty. It didn't. It was low, asymmetrical, patched in 3 shades of brown and gray, the edges reinforced with tape and cord, the roof sloping just enough to shed freezing rain toward the outer side of the enclosure. But looked intentional. The kind of ugly that appears when every line has a reason. Raymond made one more adjustment that night. And it was the adjustment that revealed how much of the store he had been reading while everyone thought he was hiding from it. Along the service wall behind the enclosure, there was a section of block that stayed slightly warmer than the rest. Not warm enough to notice in autumn. In winter, with bare hands, you could feel the difference. Mechanical lines ran behind that chase. And a louver farther down cycled out waste warmth from equipment that did not care what month it was. Raymond did not block the louver. He did not tamper with the wall. He simply positioned the shelter's broadest insulated side tight to the block and built a narrow baffle channel between the exterior shell and the masonry, enough to borrow a few ambient degrees from what the building was already surrendering. To most people, 3 or 4 degrees sounds trivial. To a man sleeping outside in freezing rain, 3 or 4 degrees is the difference between waking every 40 minutes in pain and getting enough uninterrupted sleep to think the next day. That first proof did not arrive with applause. It arrived as numbers in a pocket notebook. Raymond had 2 thermometers, one cheap digital unit with a probe wire he had rescued from a discarded cooler display, and one cloudy analog dial he did not fully trust but liked as a second opinion. He placed the digital sensor near his shoulder height inside the shelter and hung the analog just outside under the roof lip. On the first cold test night, with the outside air at 23 degrees and a light northwest wind, the interior air settled at 37 after 45 minutes. When he turned on the seat pad and crawled fully into his sleeping system, moving blanket, worn sleeping bag, wool layer, 2 dry socks safe for night use only, the surface temperature of the sleeping platform climbed into the high 40s. By midnight, with his body heat trapped properly in the wall doing its small invisible work, the air inside held at 41. To someone a house, that sounds miserable. To someone outside, dry, out of the wind, on a raised platform, breathing air above, freezing while the world around him hardens in a glass, it feels close to luxury. He logged the numbers, because numbers don't care who you used to be. The second proof was not in a notebook. It was in the absence of frost. On bitter mornings, bad shelters advertise failure the moment a zipper opens. The inside blooms white. Breath freezes onto the roof. Damp fabric turns brittle. Sleeping bags pick up a crust. Raymond's little capsule, for all its ugliness, stayed drier than it had any right to. The vent hoods did their job. Moisture escaped instead of raining back down on him. His blanket did not freeze to the wall. The cardboard layers remained crisp rather than pulpy. When Mason crouched and looked in one morning before shift change, he expected the smell of mildew and a fog of breath. What he found was a narrow, organized space lit by a small battery lamp, with Raymond sitting up slowly from real sleep, one hand wrapped around a coffee cup, the interior reading 39 degrees while the dial outside sat 19. Mason stared at the 2 thermometers as if one of them had to be lying. "You slept in that." Raymond took a sip. "That was the idea. How warm is it in there?" Raymond turned the digital display outward. "Warmer than the lot." Mason looked at the pallets, the foam, the taped seams, the tucked entrance tunnel. "I thought this was just, I don't know, a mess." Mason gave a small, embarrassed shrug. Raymond glanced around a capsule. "Mess with a roof's still better than no roof." The forecast worsened by noon. What had been a winter event became, in a language meteorologists use when trying to sound calm about ugly things, a prolonged freezing rain episode with significant ice accretion and hazardous travel expected. Employees leaving daytime shift were already finding a glazed skin on their windshields. Cart attendants moved slower. Delivery trucks came in late. Somebody from the garden center scattered salt that disappeared almost instantly under fresh sheen. The sky took on that sealed, metallic color it gets before weather stops feeling local and starts feeling total. Raymond spent the afternoon making the shelter storm ready. He added a second exterior skin over the windward side using shrink wrap stretched tight between pallet slats, then protected that with more cardboard so the plastic wouldn't drum and tear under gusts. He weighted the base with 2 sandbags somebody had abandoned near the lawn section after summer. He lowered the roof pitch slightly to prevent ice load from collecting in one heavy spine. He cut a tiny drip edge from a strip of plastic signboard and taped it above the entrance throat so meltwater would break and fall away instead of running inside. He wrapped the battery compartment in another layer of insulation to protect performance in the cold. He filled 2 one-gallon jugs with the hottest water he could get from a public restroom sink and buried them under the sleeping platform insulation where they could bleed heat upwards slowly through the night. Not enough to brag about, enough to matter. By evening, the guards had stopped laughing. That did not mean they respected him yet. People often stop mocking only because something has become too deliberate to dismiss, not because they have revised their opinion of the person doing it. But the tone changed. Alvarez now spoke in the voice men use when they do not want to admit curiosity. "You think that thing really makes it through tonight?" Raymond was trimming a flap of blanket from the crawl entrance. "If the ice doesn't pin the roof before I clear it." "You gonna be out here in that?" Raymond checked the tie-down knot, then sat back on his heels. "Better than being out there in that." He nodded toward the open lot. where the first hard pellets of freezing rain were already ticking against the asphalt. The shift change came and the back lot thinned. Engine started. Door slammed. The store kept glowing, indifferent as ever, while the space behind it grew lonelier and more dangerous by the minute. Ice formed on the chain-linked gate one diamond at a time. The loading dock bumpers shone black. The dumpsters took on a dull mineral glaze. The coal became visible on every surface. Inside the shelter, Raymond did what experienced men do before a bad night. He made the system boring. He laid out what he would need in reach before he needed it. Gloves under the right hip, headlamp hanging from a nail, spare socks in a sealed grocery bag, knife tucked flat, notebook, thermometers, battery lead checked twice, water bottle insulated in a wool sock so the neck would not freeze shut. He ate something dense and unglamorous. Peanut butter on cheap bread, half a bruised banana, a packet of crackers, the kind of calories that disappear into a body without ceremony. He changed into his dry sleep layer with the efficiency of someone who knows that getting caught half-dressed in freezing rain is how simple tasks become emergencies. Then he waited while the storm assembled itself. One of the strangest things about severe winter weather is how often it begins softly, not with a howl, with a hush. Traffic fades first, then distant noises blur. The rain changes pitch. A place as brightly artificial as a superstore's rear service lane starts to seem remote, cut off in the ordinary country of warm people and working vehicles. The light remains, but the world beneath it no longer behaves. By 10 o'clock, the ice had turned the lot into a mirror scuffed by tire tracks and salt. Wind hit the enclosure in sudden slaps. Somewhere out near the perimeter road, a branch cracked with a gunshot sound Greenwood makes when it gives up. Raymond lay inside the capsule, listening to the skin of the shelter tremble. Now, and then sleet rattled across the roof. The little digital display near his elbow read 36 inside, 13 outside. He clicked on the seat pad for 20 minutes, then off, saving battery. Heat pooled where his torso touched the platform. The warm water jugs under the insulation did what he had hoped, flattening the early temperature drop. He could feel the difference not as comfort exactly, but as mercy. At 11:15, the first serious problem arrived. The wind shifted east. That mattered because the entrance, angled to defeat the north wind, now sat vulnerable to driven ice that began hissing along the ground and blowing into the throat in granular bursts. Raymond felt the change before he saw it. A thin draft touched the side of his neck. Then another. He switched on the lamp, crawled halfway out, and found the lower flap beginning to stiffen where sleet was collecting in the fold. In weather that cold, small failures do not remain small for long. He backed out into the storm. The lot hit him like a handful of nails. Freezing rain peppered his face. The wind stole his breath on the first inhale. He knelt on the ice with gloved fingers, already losing finesse, and unhooked the flap, lowered it an inch farther, then fixed a scrap of rigid plastic at the base as a kick-out deflector so the sleet would glance off rather than pack against the opening. He drove 2 new screws through a strap in a pallet wood using his stubby screwdriver and the heel of his palm because the metal shaft was too cold to handle long. 30 seconds, maybe 50. By the time he got back inside, the numbness had climbed through his fingers like a chemical. He knew better than to lie there and hope the sensation returned on its own. He tucked his hands under his armpits, breathed slowly, checked the thermometers, then forced himself to sit up until the pins and needles became pain, and the pain became ownership again. Outside temperature now, 11. Inside, 34 and falling. He turned the seat pad on low. The shelter did not feel triumphant. It felt narrow, deliberate, and earned minute by minute. Just after midnight, Mason came around on foot with his hood cinched tight and ice beads hanging from the brim. He had meant only to check the gate and make sure nobody was passed out where a truck might come through. But the little shelter in the corner kept drawing his attention like a question that would not leave him alone. He shone his light once toward the entrance, saw the flap move, and heard Raymond's voice from inside. "Don't leave it on me long. It'll kill the night vision." Mason lowered the beam immediately. "You all right in there?" There was a pause, then the flap lifted a few inches. Warmth did not pour out. Nothing dramatic, but the air inside was clearly not the air outside. It carried the dry, contained smell of cardboard, wool, and electronics rather than wet concrete. Raymond's face appeared in the opening, wind reddened but steady. "Doing maintenance," he said. Mason crouched. "How warm is it?" Raymond held the digital unit toward him. 38. Mason checked his own phone weather app, as if the app had some authority the thermometer lacked. 10 degrees feels like -4. He looked back at the number in Raymond's hand, and then at the ridiculous little structure wedged between the wall and dumpster. Ow! Raymond's eyes went to the block wall beside him, then to the raised floor, then to the half-closed entrance, as if the answer were obvious. Small space, dry layers, no wind, heat where it counts. Mason stared 1 second longer, not just at the shelter, but at the order inside it. The careful placement, the absence of panic, the fact that the man everyone had mentally filed under nuisance seemed to understand the night better than most of the employees driving home through it. "Do you need anything?" Raymond considered. If you got spare hot water from the break room later, that'd hold longer than coffee. Mason nodded once. "I'll see." He did. 15 minutes later, he came back with 2 cap paper cups shoved inside a plastic bag to keep them upright, and he passed them through the flap like an offering too small to be called one. Raymond emptied the water into the gallon jugs, retucked them under the platform, and the inside air climbed 1 degree over the next half hour. A degree is nothing until it isn't. Outside, the storm intensified into the kind of weather that makes every hard surface sound occupied. Ice clicked against metal posts. The loose end of a chain, somewhere near receiving, struck a hollow beat in the wind. Water ran, froze, ran again, froze thicker. The shelter held. Raymond dozed in short stretches, waking to check the roof, the vent, the battery draw. Once, just before 2, the power in the store blinked. The service lights dimmed, surged back, then settled. 4 or 5 seconds, the entire rear lot went almost black, and in that brief failure the storm seemed much bigger than the building, bigger than commerce, bigger than any human arrangement at all. Just ice, wind, and the sound of branches failing in the dark. When the lights returned, Alvarez was standing under the overhang near the loading dock, watching the corner. He had spent the first half of the night assuming he would eventually be the one to find Raymond in trouble. An ambulance call, hypothermia, some preventable stupidity he could point to later and say, "See, that's why you don't let people do this." The expectation had comforted him. It kept the world simple. Mockery is often just laziness protected by certainty. At 2:30, certainty abandoned him. A fresh gust from the east drove a ribbon of sleet through the enclosure and punched hard against the shelter's roof. The outer blanket snapped. A weight shifted. The roof line dipped just enough to tell Raymond something underneath had slipped. He was out of shelter instantly, lamb strap over his cap, one knee already in the ice. Alvarez saw him emerge and started toward the corner with the reflex of a man expecting failure at last. What he found was not a collapse. It was a repair. Raymond had one hand bracing the roof, and the other working a cut pallet brace back into place where the ice load had forced it sideways. His movements were controlled, economical, the way mechanics work under a car. They cannot afford to be sentimental beneath. He knocked ice from the roof with the side of his forearm, reset the brace, retention the cord line, and added a backup strap through a lower anchor point. His gloves were crusted white at the knuckles. Ice shone in his beard. When the wind hit, he turned his body to take it broadside and kept working. Alvarez stopped 3 steps away, oddly useless. "You need a hand?" he asked, the words sounding unfamiliar in his own mouth. Raymond did not look up. "Hold that line level." Alvarez obeyed before he had time to realize he was obeying. Together, they kept the roof steady while Raymond locked the brace and secured the strap. It took less than a minute. Then Raymond tested the roof with a shove, nodded once to himself, and ducked back inside. Alvarez remained crouched there under the sleet, line still in hand, feeling stupid for reasons he could not immediately sort out. Stupid because he had left. Stupid because the man in the corner had not built a joke. He had built a system. Ugly, improvised, yes, but a system all the same. The flap opened again. Raymond extended the thermometer. 37. Outside, Alvarez's breath smoked in the air, just above single digits. He lowered his light. Thought you'd be worse off. Raymond gave a tired half-smile that did not quite become amusement. Most bad shelters look fine until the weather gets serious. Alvarez glanced at the roof. The sealed seams, the entrance baffle, the elevated floor disappearing into shadow. This is serious. Yeah, Raymond said. That's why I built it. There are moments when a person's place in other people's minds changes without announcement. No apology, no speech, just a quiet rearrangement. The guards still had the same uniforms. Raymond still had the same cart, the same worn coat, the same address of nowhere. Nothing official had changed, but the storm was now doing what storms sometimes do. It was stripping appearances away and leaving competence naked in the light. Around 3:30 the lot became almost unnavigable. One delivery truck was rerouted before it reached the dock. Another simply never showed. The ice on the service road thickened until even the slow utility cart for maintenance fishtailed. Key made his round carefully, boot soles crunching on granular salt that no longer seemed equal to the task. He stopped at the shelter and knocked gently on the outer wall with the back of his glove. Raymond answered from inside. "You all right?" "Still here." Keen handed in a chemical hand warmer through the flap. For backup, Raymond accepted it, then after a beat asked, "How's the lot?" "Bad," Keen said. A tree came down near the far entrance. Couple employees sleeping in their cars till daylight. Raymond took that in. Cars get cold faster than folks think. Keen grunted. "I'm started to notice." He looked at the little shelter, really looked. Not the embarrassment of it, the engineering, the refusal to surrender beauty as a criterion for whether something is smart. He had worked long enough to know another uncomfortable truth. The people closest to failure often understand systems most intimately because systems are what fail on them first. Doors, boilers, tires, paychecks, weather stripping, social patience, insurance, heating bills. They become unwilling experts in the seams of the world. Inside, Raymond drifted in and out of shallow sleep. At intervals, he recorded the temperatures. 2 a.m. outside 9, inside 36. 3 a.m. outside 8, inside 37 after hot water recharge. 4 a.m. outside 7, inside 35, roof cleared battery half. 4:45 a.m. outside 7, inside 39 with seat pad on cycle, wind louder. He wrote neatly despite the cold. Old work habits. If something matters, log it. If you survive, remember why. Sometime after 5, when the storm had exhausted its most violent energy and settled into a steady, punishing glaze, the back lot entered that strange hour before dawn when the world is neither night nor morning, only endurance. The lights hummed. Ice drooped from the dumpster lids in clear tusks. The store's huge brick wall gave off no comfort anyone could see. Yet in that corner, behind ugliness, there remained a dry cavity of controlled air, a sleeping platform off the ground, 2 warm jugs cooling slowly, and one man alive because he had not mistaken shame for uselessness. It will be easy to tell this part the wrong way, easy to make it sentimental. It's easy to pretend the storm transformed everyone into better people. It didn't. Morning still came with policy, with schedules, with a manager who did not want the back lot turning into a camp, with the practical fact that Raymond still had nowhere durable to go after the weather broke. Hardship did not vanish because intelligence had briefly become visible, but something did change, and it changed in the only way that mattered. People stopped seeing him as drift. They started seeing him as a man who knew something. When dawn finally thinned the dark, the shelter looked smaller than ever. Ice silvered the outer blanket. The cord lines wore crystal beads. The entrance flap opened and Raymond slid himself out carefully, stiff but clear-eyed, one glove hand on the roof as if thanking it without quite admitting the gesture. His beard had frosted at the edges. His knees cracked when he stood. He turned, checked the tie-downs again out of habit, then looked up at the morning as though measuring what remained of it. Mason was near the dock with a paper cup in each hand. He crossed the ice and offered one over. Coffee, and not the bad kind. Raymond took it. That narrows it down some. Mason gave a brief laugh, and then, because curiosity had finally outrun whatever embarrassment was left, asked the question he had been carrying all night. How long did it take you to figure that out? Raymond looked back at the shelter. Which part? All of it. The answer might have been 3 days of building, or 20 years of maintenance work, or 3 winters outside, or the whole long education of losing things and discovering that the mind, if it remains disciplined, is one of the last assets winter can't easily confiscate. He let the steam from the coffee rise into his face before speaking. Long enough to know Cole doesn't care how stupid something looks, he said. Mason followed his gaze to the taped, patched, absurd little structure tucked behind the dumpsters. In the clean morning light, it was still ugly, maybe uglier, but no one was laughing now. If you have ever been tempted to trust appearance more than function, to assume that intelligence announces itself with polish, to believe that dignity disappears when a person runs out of money and a mailing address, it is worth staying in that corner a moment longer. Because what happened there was not magic. It was an observation. It was physics practiced without vanity. It was a man reduced in the eyes of strangers to a nuisance, quietly solving a harder problem than most of them had ever faced. And it was proof, measurable proof, arriving in the least glamorous form imaginable. A higher thermometer reading inside a patch shelf scrap while the world outside turned to iron. By mid-morning, the attitude change had become visible in small things. Alvarez did not bark at him to move immediately. He came over with 2 fresh contractor bags for maintenance and set them against the wall without commentary. He mentioned a church 3 miles south that had open daytime cots and wrote the address down on the back of a receipt. Mason asked, awkwardly, whether the raised floor mattered more than the insulation, and Raymond answered him seriously, because serious questions deserve serious answers no matter who asks them. The floor first, he said. Always. Then air leaks. Then moisture. People chase heat before they stop loss. Mason nodded, as if filing the sentence away for a future he had never imagined needing it in. That was the thing the storm altered most. Not sympathy exactly. Respect. Respect is more durable and harder won. Sympathy can remain distant. Respect forces revision. It says the story I was telling myself about this person no longer fits the evidence in front of me. By noon, the shelter had become a quiet rumor among the employees who used the back door. The guy behind the dumpster stayed warmer than the lot. The guards had checked. He had numbers. He had built it from trash and a battery and some kind of wall trick. People passed by slowly, try not to stare. A few did anyway. One stalker crouched for half a second, peered into the capsule, and stood again without a word, as though speaking too loudly might break the logic of it. Raymond accepted none of this as vindication in the dramatic sense. He knew better. Weather had given him a fair hearing, that was all. Winter had interrogated the build, and not yet found a fatal flaw. The social reversal was real, but it was still fragile, still made of moments. He had seen enough of life to know that one hard night does not rewrite all the systems that made a man vulnerable in the first place. So after he drank the coffee and warmed his hands and let feeling return fully to his fingers, he began maintenance again. He scraped ice from the roof edge, retaped one seam where wind had worried the corner loose, checked the battery voltage with a tiny meter missing half its casing, lifted the entrance flap to inspect for dampness, emptied a bit of melted runoff away from the base. That, more than anything, is what finally settled over the guards. He was not performing resilience for them. He was living by it, quietly, competently, without an audience in mind. Later that afternoon, after the worst of the roads had begun to loosen and plows finally clawed tracks into the outer lanes, Alvarez stood smoking under the dock overhang and looked toward the corner where the shelter rested low against the wall. The ice had dulled to a wet shine. Water dripped from the enclosure roof in deliberate, glassy beads. Raymond was inside, reorganizing his gear with the flap open just enough to let light in. Alvarez flicked ash, then said to no one in particular, "I thought he was building a coffin." Keen, beside him, watched the same corner. Turns out he was building chance. Neither man added anything after that. By the second night, the storm had weakened, but the cold remained. The guards made their rounds as before, only slower near the enclosure now, not because they were worried he would cause trouble, because there was a person there, and they had finally learned his name. Mason used it first. "You need more hot water, Raymond." It was a small sentence. Small sentences are often where respect begins. The world did not rush in to reward him. There was no manager offering a job on the spot, no miraculous apartment key, no cinematic rescue arriving just because he had survived in an admirable way. Real life is stingier than that, but the moral weight of the story was never in whether fortune suddenly reversed. It was in the refusal of a man, under conditions designed to reduce him to a cautionary outline, to stop thinking clearly. He took what the backlot offered and no more. Geometry, shielding, waste warmth, discarded materials, a battery that still held enough charge to matter. He translated them into hours of survivable sleep during a storm that made armed guards pace and curse and check their weather apps every 10 minutes. There's a kind of intelligence that receives praise because it arrives in plans, patents, and polished demonstrations. And there's another kind, quieter and in some ways more ancient, that lives in survival. In layered cardboard turned crosswise, in an entrance lowered by an inch because the wind changed, in understanding that if you cannot afford abundance, you must master containment. That second kind of intelligence rarely gets called brilliance, usually gets called desperate, until the weather tests it. Then people notice. A few days later, when the ice had melted down to black runoff and crushed salt, Raymond dismantled only part of the shelter, not because it had failed, because he knew better than to make permanence too visible in a place owned by policy. He kept the floor system, folded the moving blanket, retied the foam boards, left the frame low and ambiguous, more stacked than structure unless you knew how to read it. The corner returned, at a glance, to being what it had always been in everyone else's mind, a service space nobody was supposed to care about. But the guards cared now, not sentimentally, not loudly. Mason would sometimes leave a cup of hot water on the concrete lip before the temperature dropped. Keen once brought him a section of intact foam from a damaged seasonal display and said only, "Thought this was your kind of thing." Even Alvarez, whose contempt had been quickest and most reflexive, stopped addressing him as if he were clutter. One night he came around on his round, paused at the enclosure, and said, with the awkwardness of a man unpracticed in correction, "Storm coming again Friday. You got enough tape?" Raymond looked up from the seam he was reinforcing. "For now." Alvarez nodded. "All right." He lingered 1 second, then added, "That floor idea was smart." Raymond gave the faintest tilt of his head. Most people lose to the slab before they lose to the air. Alvarez absorbed that, the way men do when they have learned something they wish they had not needed another man to teach them. Then he moved on. And so the title of the story, if you strip away the drama and leave only its bones, is true in the plainest way. A homeless man turned a Walmart dumpster corner into a heated shelter, and an ice storm changed every guard's attitude, not because pity descended from the sky with the freezing rain, because evidence did, because the night forced witnesses to compare what they had assumed with what was physically happening in front of them, because a ridiculous-looking structure held warmth, dryness, and life while the polished surfaces of the modern world, roads, locks, windshields, schedules, failed all around it. Long after the storm, what stayed with people was not just that he survived there. It was the image, a narrow shelter pressed into the darkest corner of a lot, silver tape lines catching the dock light, ice hanging from the dumpster lid like clear teeth, breath moving in the air outside but not frosting the roof within, and a man everyone had nearly mistaken for wreckage, lying in a space he had engineered with patience and scraps, warm enough to sleep while the whole backside of the store hardened under an indifferent sky that is worth remembering the next time something useful looks ugly, the next time a person's competence is hidden beneath exhaustion, poverty, or the wrong address. The next time the world tries to convince you that only polished things are well made, because winter has never cared about appearances. It asks only whether a thing holds. And in that frozen corner behind the store, beneath the hiss of lingering sleet and the fluorescent hum of a building too large to notice one man unless weather made invisible, something held. Toward evening, when a light thinned and the cold began gathering again in the concrete, Mason made his round one more time. The lot had quieted. Tires whispered on wet asphalt. Water dripped from the enclosure in steady intervals. In the corner, tucked low against the block wall, the little shelter gave off almost nothing to the eye, just the dark shape under a skin of patched fabric and tape. But from the narrow seam at the entrance, in the blue hour before night settled fully, there drifted the faintest ribbon of vapor. Not much. Just enough to prove there was still warmth inside, while the rest of the lot went hard and silver around it.